Wildlife Diversity Administrator Jennifer Newmark for possible action. The department will present the commission with background information regarding commercial collection of reptiles in Nevada, along with numerous potential alternatives for consideration. The commission may choose to provide direction to the department regarding commercial collection of reptiles. Ms. Newmark.
Good afternoon. For the record, I'm Jennifer Newmark. I am the Wildlife Diversity Administrator for Nevada Department of Wildlife. To start out our conversation today, I'm going to first start talking about the pertinent legal authorities, and I'm going to kind of read this a little bit verbatim just so that we're really clear on where we stand with that. So NRS 503.30 says the department may permit the commercial taking of unprotected wildlife in any manner approved by the commission. The commission may fix a price to be paid for wildlife so taken, and wildlife taken under this authorization may be sold. In NAC 503.095, it states that the department will issue a permit authorizing a natural person to collect unprotected wildlife for commercial purposes if after an investigation is conducted, it is proved to the department that the collecting will not be detrimental to the wildlife. Such a permit may be canceled by the department for a violation of its conditions or if operation of the permit is found to be detrimental to the wildlife. So in 1986, commercial collection of reptiles were legalized by changing NAC 503.095. And in 1989, the department expressed concern to the Board of Wildlife Commissioners that reptile populations were being impacted by overcollection. The commissioners agreed with the department and they drafted temporary Regulation 173, which stated possession or collection of reptiles for commercial purposes is prohibited. After that point, the collectors initiated legal action against the commission, and this resulted in the 8th District Court injunction preventing the enforcement of CGR 173. The commission appealed this to the Supreme Court, and in 1990, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the commission and reversed the lower court's decision. The Supreme Court said in part that the commission did not have a duty to conduct an investigation which proved that the selling of reptiles would not harm the state's wildlife, and that under NAC 503.095, the burden is on the collectors, not the commission, to show no harm to wildlife. The regulation did not confer protected status on unprotected reptiles, and the trial court erred in failing to consider that there are economic benefits in preserving, protecting, and managing wildlife. During this legal process, temporary CGR 173 expired, and at that time, the commission again directed the department to start issuing permits for commercial reptile collections. In 1998, the topic was again brought to the commission, and 2 workshops were held. And it was again decided by the commission to allow the continuation of unlimited commercial collection during all seasons. So here's where we are today. This is a permitted activity. It's based annually, so every year the permits are renewed, and there is a $250 fee. You must be a Nevada resident to hold the permit. And under that permit, 90% of our reptile species are allowed to be collected in unlimited numbers. I'm going to go through a couple of the stipulations that the permit requires. It allows for methods of collection to be hand, noose, snake hook, tongs, or nets, and it prohibits pit, can, or fall type traps or containers for collecting reptiles. It also prohibits the use of crowbars, jackhammers, or other methods to break apart rocks and ledges, which results in permanently destroying habitat for reptiles. And it also states that only the named permittee on the permit is allowed to collect. Furthermore, those collections, they must log daily catch, so they're required to report species, the number, the sex, the age, the day, time, and UTM that animal was collected at, and they must submit those reports monthly to the department. They're also required to maintain transaction logs of sales, trades, and barters, and they must maintain those logs for a year after their valid permit. Again, the permit stipulates that, that the permit can be canceled if the department determines that conditions of the permit have been violated, or if operation of the permit is found to be detrimental to wildlife, and the commission may also revoke a permit and may refuse to issue another such permit. So this next section, this is a lot of the same information that you've been provided by Jason Jones, our reptile biologist in Southern Nevada, but just to remind us the context, since 1986, we've had more than 450,000 reptiles removed from our landscape. And again, we are the only Western state that allows unlimited commercial taking of reptiles. Looking at the state, this is a little dark and I apologize for that, but this map shows the areas of the state that are commonly collected at. Different species are collected at these spots year after year, which allows for the continued collecting at the same spots. But it also creates the potential for significant localized population impacts. You can also see that some species are quite heavily collected. For example, if you look at desert horn lizards, over 105,000 have been taken and 600 were removed in a single day. In addition to the large numbers of animals that are removed in short amounts of times in the same areas, we also see animals being removed at the peak of the breeding season. So if you look at this graph in the lower right-hand corner, that's looking at all the collections that happen throughout the year, and you see that the collections are happening in June, July, and August primarily, and that coincides with a lot of the breeding seasons for our animals. And then when you start looking, and again, you've seen this from Jason, but when you start looking at these particular areas, you can start noticing that there is diminishing return for effort. So what the red lines are showing you in the top part of those graphs is the number of days that were spent out collecting, and then the bottom graph is showing you the numbers of animals. And so you can see that after there are peak years of collection, in the following years, they're collecting less animals in those same areas. And that's true. We're just illustrating here these two valleys, but this is true of many of the areas that we've been looking at. Looking statewide, this is another sort of pattern of how species are being collected. So in 1994, this was the highest number of years that were, highest number of reported animals that were taken, over 31,000. And if you look at the map of the state in 1994, you can see that the footprint of where those animals were taken is relatively small. In 2001, 10,000 animals less are taken, but the footprint on the state is even larger. And then moving on down to 2016, you can see that there's only 7,000 animals that are taken, but the footprint is starting to move to the east and to the north. And if you look at individual species, and we'll look at the Chuckwalla, you can also see declining patterns in their populations. So here, again, you've seen this before, but to remind you, the graph on the right is looking at the numbers collected compared to the year before. So any dot that's above the red line means that there were more animals collected than there were the year before. And any dot below the red line means that there was less animals collected than in the year before. And so what this pattern is showing you is that if there's a year of positive collection, then in the subsequent years after, there's decreased opportunity for collection. And this makes sense biologically from what we know about chuckwallas in terms of generation time and longevity and their habitat preferences. So Jason presented in earlier meetings this analysis for the top 8 species that are collected, and this pattern is seen for all those species. Reptiles are a unique group of animals, and their biology leads them to be vulnerable to overcollection. So we have 53 native species in Nevada, which is pretty amazing. We have that diversity because we have 2 separate deserts that are represented here, the Great Basin and the Mojave. And I should also note that over half of the landmass of those 2 deserts are in our state. So our stewardship responsibility for the reptiles that are endemic to those deserts is quite high. Also, 26 of our 53 species are species of conservation priority in the Nevada Wildlife Action Plan. So many of our reptiles are habitat specialists. They have patchy distributions. This makes recruitment of individuals difficult once the local populations are depleted. Their home ranges are relatively small, which really limits their ability to disperse and recolonize over wider areas. They're ectothermic animals or cold-blooded animals, so because they regulate their body temperature based on ambient temperature, they often have limited activity compared to warm-blooded animals. And again, this limits their abilities to disperse and repopulate areas. They often have low reproductive rates and long lifespans. And we don't understand a lot of the biology of our species because a lot of reptiles are very cryptic, they're hard to find. They often spend a good portion of their active periods underground or hiding. They're only seasonally active, so there'll be long periods of months when you can't find them at all. They're long-lived, and we have a lot of them in the state, as we've talked about. Again, collections are allowed during the breeding season, so this reduces the reproductive ability of these animals, and it also reduces the recovery potential. So if you're removing adults that are right before they're breeding, it's harder, we don't get the recruitment that we need for the populations to recover. And then commercial collection is an additive source of mortality. So we already know that reptiles are threatened by habitat loss and degradation, urbanization and development, invasive species. Disease is becoming a more and more important threat to them. We've got drought and climate changes, and then we also know that there's incidental mortality associated with pitfall traps, which we'll talk about in just a minute. Lastly, I'd like to just point out that market demand is what drives the collection for certain species rather than population or management objectives. So what's being taken off the landscape is dictated by the demand for them in the pet trade rather than us as a scientific community looking to see what their populations can handle. So in the past, we've talked about the potential for data collected by the collectors to help us better understand the populations and the biology of these cryptic species. And so I want to spend a few minutes just talking about that data. We've been spending some time digging into it and looking at it and trying to understand better the populations. And what we're finding in terms of being able to make management decisions, that data is quite limited. So in those data sheets, we get age class structure, but it's only adults or juveniles. And about 90% of the data that's reported to us are adults. And we know from biology that the distribution of adults to juveniles is not going to be 90% to 10%. So that limits our abilities to understand recruitment and what the next year's populations are going to be like. Data are often reported along linear features such as roads, so it's not providing the habitat associations in a fine enough scale that allows us to really use it. There isn't any independent verification of the data, and as I'll illustrate in a few minutes, the data has a lot of errors in it that we've found, and so it makes it difficult to really use it. So here's a couple of examples. And this example from July, in 6 hours, 56 animals were collected. They were collected from a very small area, and all of the species that were reported were nocturnal animals. However, they were collected during the day. And the density of animals per square meter is very high, which really doesn't fit with what we know biologically is possible. We know that highly territorial and density-dependent species are being reported, collected from a very, very small area. And again, this doesn't jive with what we biologically know of a territorial species. They tend to spread themselves out more than what is reported. And then we have species that are being reported out of range. So for example, here, this is a banded gecko. They're a Mojave species, and we have not just a couple, but several reports of them from the Great Basin. So lastly, I just want to visit the topic of pitfall traps again, and remind everyone that pitfall trapping is an illegal method of collection. It's not the way that reptiles are allowed to be collected. And we've been told that the traps are used to collect scorpions and not reptiles. But we know from monitoring several trap lines that these are also significant sources of mortality for our reptiles. So not only do we have the collected numbers, but we have this additional mortality that's associated with these traps. Again, you've seen this from Jason's presentation, but this just gives you some ideas on what we're seeing. 64% of the traps that we've checked have contained reptiles and mammals and scorpions as well. And almost half of those animals, the reptiles, were dead, some of them. And then in the mammals, almost all of them were dead. So it's significant mortality for more than just reptiles. These traps have been on the landscape for a long time. So for example, in 1992, we found 83 pitfall traps near Nelson, Nevada, 452 dead lizards, 136 rodents, and 3 dead tortoises were found in those traps. And this is in addition to the 85 live reptiles that were released. So all those traps were destroyed at that time, but we know there's at least 700 more on the landscape, and they open 365 days a year, and they can be collecting animals at all that time. So it is a significant source of mortality, and it does leave us concerned for the population status of our species. So with that context in mind, there's a couple of opportunities for the commission to consider taking today. You could direct the department to take no further action and to continue to allow unlimited commercial reptile collecting. You could direct the department to draft a permanent regulation that prohibits commercial reptile collecting. You could direct the department to cease permitting commercial reptile collecting, or direct the department to develop recommendations that limit commercial collection based on species, year, season, and/or collection area in the state. And I'd like to also point out that these actions can be taken independently, or they could be taken in combination with each other. So I'm happy to answer any questions, and if there are any.
Thank you, Ms. Newmark. Questions for Ms. Newmark? I think we're good for right now. Comments or discussion from the commission before I take it out to public comment? Okay. Seeing none, I'll take it out to public comment on agenda item number 11, commercial reptile collection. Come on up, sir.
You mark down on the cards that we're going to speak, you're not going to call them and come up. Is that correct? You know, let the other ones that didn't mark it down speak before come up commercial reptile.
That's correct. I'd just like you guys to come up one at a time, and we'll take your public comment. We'll go from there. Thank you.
I apologize for my dress. I was in the field up in northern Nevada, and I found out about this Wednesday afternoon. I had no idea this was going to happen today. Good afternoon to you all. My name is Thomas L. Betts. This is not my first time speaking before this commission on this subject, but it is my first time talking to you. I'm 57 years old, a native of Nevada. I've been catching reptiles here since I was 7. I've been doing it commercially since I was 9. I understand the department is estimating the average of around 14,000 reptiles are being taken annually. I personally take the lion's share of these at about 7,500 to 8,000 annually. For more than the past 3 decades, I have been doing this under the permit from NDOW. For the past 2 decades, I have spent more than 200 days in the field each season, all day long. For the last 10 years, I've spent more than 300 days in the field, all day long. I have observed many fascinating and enlightening things over this many years about our native reptiles. The thing I've come to know that is that if anybody states anything with a certainty about reptiles, they're in error. Every day in the field, every day, I see something new that I've never seen before. It is amazing. One of the issues I have the strongest concerns about is that all the time, in all this time, I've only been contacted by the biology division before wild diversity and requested copies of forms, those data forms that I keep on hand. I keep them for years. When they've lost them by staff, I've replaced them for them. That's the only time I've ever been contacted in all these years. The packet that I've presented you, I hope is helpful in reaching a decision today. Thank you for your time. I'm familiar with how very important issues this commission deals with. If you have any questions, I'm available now. If not, I can make time for you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next public comment?
Good afternoon, my name's Robert Benz. I'm also a permanent reptile collector. That the history that they give you is not quite accurate on the commercial reptile collecting. It was outlawed, and we brought it up to the department at the time in the commission, and it was to the department that the administrator brought it up because the same thing like this meeting that we weren't noticed of. We've been collecting reptiles when they outlawed, and it didn't see anything about that they were outlawing it. When we came to the administrator, told them it's outlawed, we didn't get a chance to speak on it. We've been doing it. They gave us the opportunity to speak, and they opened it up with a sunset clause. They opened it, made it legal for a 3-year period, that it was going to automatically close in 3 years, so that they didn't have to worry about closing it again if it wasn't acceptable. They let that go for 1 year. That's in the 89, where it came up again, where they're saying that they closed down. They automatically closed down because it had a sunset clause. And so when it went in front of it again, we went, got it open where it was available for us to collect again, and then they shut it down in 89, and that's when we got the injunction for to be able to do it, because we didn't feel like that we were getting a fair shake from it, that they were making the decision on it. It became a big issue because it was a question of whether the department had the ability to say yes or no over the wildlife. That's when it went to the Supreme Court, and they left it open because if it had ran its course, it would have been on the record as that went legal. So it was a legality that they had to leave it open, and where we were still collecting at the time. When the Supreme Court shut it down, they had it open because they had to leave it open because legislative for the legal aspect, so that it didn't go as setting a precedent. It came back again that they had to vote on it. We came back in front of the commission again after we had just lost from the Supreme Court, and the commission was told they can do what they want with it. The commission decided to open it up again and let us collect. There's a couple issues, I don't want to take a lot of time. There's a couple of issues that I want to address. And that one of them, that the biggest issue was, it was the fox guarding the hen house. That was the biggest question, because we're reporting ourselves, we're giving the information. At the time, there was no information. The only information they were getting from was the information we were giving them. And what we were supposed to give them was baseline data, where we go out there, and the other thing is where they see out here that there's UTM coordinates for you to do it. its township section and range, we started the UTMs because the township section and range was too broad. It gives a whole mile of area. It wasn't specific. When the GPS came in where we could use GPS, we started using that. The head of the law enforcement jumped and said, who told you could use this? And the biologist said, no, this is giving accurate data. Don't stop them from doing this. We've been doing it steady for 30 years. There is no violation. Have never, of the ones of the family that went and fought and got this thing, when we told them that we were doing this, that it wasn't something that we do, it's who we are. We proved it over the 30 years that we have done just exactly what we said we were going to do, that there weren't any violations from any. Now, they've had like 3 or 4 violations. I've had one myself that I turned in a collector that was collecting, that had a permit, didn't have a permit any longer, that I caught out in the field, and he was selling to someone that had a permit, laundering it through. I called the department and told them that this guy's collecting for them to sell it to catch him, and you can verify that with the department if you think that I'm not telling you. We've garnered this as our baby.
Sir, I hate to interrupt you, but we do have a 3-minute time limit, and I've let you go a little longer, but if you could wrap it up for us and
Okay,
move to the next one.
One of the things is the cans, responsible for it. Like she said, we had the cans when we first started in this with the department. We had the cans out there catching the scorpions. They wanted to regulate the cans that they were going to set to where you check them and everything, and we told them, we don't take reptiles in the cans, these are scorpion traps. The lizards that are in the cans are feeding the scorpions that we're catching them. The cans are working usually during the rainy season. That's when the stuff gets active. The species that they're speaking about, like the nocturnal species that don't spread out in the range, they're in these, under the cans that we have a board that goes over the top that they don't denote in that. It looks like you just have a can out there that falls in. There's a piece of plywood board over the top of the can that these scorpions go in underneath. It's very tight to the ground. It's not lifted up. Now, they have times when the roads go in and dig in, but these reptiles, the geckos and that, they're underneath the board on the edge of these cans that are getting reported. And I'm reporting to the place that I am mistaken. As I took it back, I would redo it now. Wouldn't do it that way. But I'm figuring the same thing is that they're not getting this data if I don't report it. They're not getting the geckos and the shovel nose in this area. So we start taking these ones knowing that they're going to say that you're coming out.
Sir, I hate to shut you down, but we've gone way past your time.
I
appreciate you getting this for us, but.
Feel free, you know.
Okay.
Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you. Next public comment.
My name's Tom Bentz. I was in at the initiation of all of this. Couple of comments before I start into my comment. There's 2 things particularly. One of them is that the department has never been in favor of this. We've come to the commission multiple times, and the commission has ruled in our favor most of the time. It's inherent with the department. I think it comes from the university when they get their degree. 2 things come out. One thing you need a biological degree, be against commercialism. Don't go for anything commercial in wildlife. Number 2, if somebody asks to help you or offer you information, don't take it because it undermines your credentials in your biology. We're field collectors. Like you said, we were given baseline information. At the beginning of this, there were only 5 stipulations to a permit. Deadfall traps weren't in there. When the first ones were discovered, about the time Steve Harden would come aboard, they said, we want to regulate this. We want to make these better. We said, we don't need to take any reptiles out there. They're for scorpions. We'll use scorpions only. The department has known about these cans for about 20 years. This is a brand new deal we're coming at now. And like he said, you would have no data on shovel nose whatsoever, except that they're underneath those boards and we started reporting those. We didn't have to report them. They would never know where the cans were, but we did that. This program is so important to us, and the integrity of this report has been so important to us that we've done everything we can for 30 years to prove it. What we promised at the beginning is that there was a renewable wildlife resource that could stand a sustainable harvest without adversely affecting the population. The reptiles that we collected, close along following a road and giving you a parallel, it's like taking a football field and running a string from one corner to the other. It's the only habitat we ever touch or affect. And then the overall 87% in Nevada that's public land, that's a very, very minute population that we even have access to. But we do collect the same roads over and over again, and our reports will substantiate that our collections are uniformly steady with the exception of wet years and drought years. When you look at the graph and it says these many reptiles were taken these years, there were over 20 collectors in those years. Now there's 9, maybe 6 active. Certainly there's less harvest. And the fact that there is a sustainable harvest is substantiated if you look at our individual permits and the numbers we take. The other thing that adversely affects the taking is if the market slows down or drops out, we stop collecting. So the numbers aren't going to be there. But what we maintained 30 years ago, and I'm proud of it, came out exactly as we said it is, exactly as we promised it to you. When we stood over for a commission and asked for the chance, and we were given it, we stood tall. In 30 years, we have no citations. The department has had the time, through the stipulations requiring the permit, to ask anyone who wanted biologically, all the information they say is unknown, they could have asked for. They could have asked to come out in the field, we would have showed them whatever they wanted to know. They never did that. They have no interest in doing that. They want to see the program fail. Thank you very much for your time. Any questions?
Not at this time. Thank you, sir. Next public comment.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Benz. I am the president of Nevada Sportsman's Unlimited and representing them today. I spoke with them. I was contacted, I believe, on Tuesday of this week, and I spoke to our board of directors, and we decided that the action we'd like to move forward with is to take no further action and continue to allow unlimited commercial reptile collecting as a rule. Now, I've been a reptile collector since, that's my son, my grandfather, you know, we can see that. That's obviously a pattern. And like the juvenile thing, that gets brought up that the juveniles aren't being reported correctly. I don't catch juveniles. I haven't caught juveniles since I was a little kid. We put them back down. So these numbers and this data that you're seeing isn't necessarily portrayed correctly. I know that these graphs look good and that you can see these fluctuations up and down, but never, like they've been saying, they've never came to us and asked us why. I have a job, so some years my collection is down. Sometimes I go out with my wife and kids and I'll be collecting, but I'm not giving it my all. It shows that I started at 8 o'clock in the morning and I stopped at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but it doesn't show that we took breaks in between, or there's nothing that really shows that data correctly. They need to come to us and ask us more often, hey, if they have questions like that, come to us. We're more than willing to help out. It's not that big of a deal if they contact us. When we were contacted through the CAB meeting down there, my family was contacted, and I made some phone calls, and I was appalled by the way it was presented. You know, these were people that actually knew me, and they thought we were going out there and catching lizards out of can traps. We don't. It's illegal. It's been illegal. I've never done it. I have no reason to do it. But as the way we report, it might show that I actually did, because I collect the same roads those cans are on. I stop work close enough to the trap, show my data that I collected that desert iguana there, and it automatically, according to this, looks like I caught it out of a can trap. That's not necessarily how it works. GPSs are 20 feet, you know, plus or minus, so that just all needs to be considered when we're looking at this data. It's not just cut and dry like it looks like. There's a whole lot of variables to it. A lot of the stuff they already said, so I'm not going to repeat it again. And thanks for your time. If you guys have any questions, please let us know.
Thank you, sir. Next public comment.
For the record, Paul Dixon, Clark, Sherman. This turned out to be a fairly lively topic at my CAB meeting. Commissioner Valentine was there, and he can attest. Generally, I think we spent 45 minutes to an hour discussing this. I think a lot of it came from the fact, like all of you on the commission right now, we know little or nothing about this. And so the person that came and spoke at my CAB meeting was within Department of Wildlife, works with raptors. He was trying to represent the work that was going on by the reptile biologists, which he got asked a lot of questions, and I think there was some confusion in how he answered versus other things. I think at the end of the day, there were several things that struck me, and I've been doing this for 9 years. One, when we did the raptor changes with federal laws, I know that we reached out to all the raptor people that collect raptors and do things. To hear these guys testify today, as well as when we asked directly at the meeting, there hadn't been a reach out by the department to the people that do this to ask the questions. And I think that in and of itself was a bit of a mistake. I think there's a lot that could be learned by interviewing these guys and sitting one-on-one on stuff. And the question is you're left with the belief that when somebody's collecting along a road or something, they're collecting hundreds of acres either side of it. When these guys testified today, I heard they collected, maybe 100 feet off the road or something with their system. So trying to look at impacts when you have animals that don't travel very far, very localized, you could deplete along a roadway, but you may not deplete a basin. And those are questions and things that we don't know the answers to when we have these discussions. Because of the large discussion, Clark Catt came up with that they wanted to direct the department to develop some recommendations that could potentially limit the harvest of certain species or put seasons out there. Once we understand things, we can actually collect the correct biological data. I mean, they've been submitting things and they've had questionnaires, and we haven't adjusted those questionnaires to get the right data. Then I kind of put that back on the department to say, why haven't you asked for the right questions? Why haven't you asked the things that you need to get to collect stuff? And it may be we have a generation of reptile biologists now that know what to ask because they went to school and done statistics, but these things should be changed. But I think at a minimum we should be interviewing the very small number of collectors here. It's really no different than doing a post-hunt survey for deer hunters, elk hunters, or whatever, and asking them for that input. But I have seen nothing to say that these guys are breaking the law or specifically doing something wrong, but what I have seen is a lot of uncertainty